Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 440 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Isabelle Fish. She is the founder of Rue Pigalle, an international community of women championing crafts and the people that make them. In our interview, we talk about her time as a gallery owner, the role of beauty in sustaining society, and the annual holiday gift collection that she created to highlight craft artists. For more information, you can go to their website. That's ruepigalle.ca. Also wanted to mention that the book Wild Clay has now been published. You heard me talk about that with Takaro Shibata, who is one of the authors along with Hitomi Shibata and Matt Levy. You can find out more about that by searching Wild Clay on Amazon or wherever you get your books. You can also go to studiotoya.com for more information. I wanted to congratulate them on the book and wish them well as it gets out into the world. If you've gotten a copy of the book, I recommend you leave a review wherever you got it, because that really helps the book take off as it goes forward. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So I thought we would start talking about how you got to Canada, because you're based in Toronto. So can you give us a little bit of background about your personal history?
Sure. So we arrived in Canada 20 years ago from London, UK. We were transferred. My husband at the time worked in the oil industry, and I think our first transfer was 96, and for about 20 years we moved a bit of a ping pong ball between London and Cape Town and The Hague and Calgary and finally Toronto.
So, yeah, the difference between Calgary and Toronto is immense in terms of Canadian culture. I mean, obviously, the difference between London and Cape Town is immense, but I wanted to focus a little bit on how you got to understand craft in Canada specifically. One of the things you do is advocate for Canadian as well as other artists, but how did you, once you moved to Canada, how did you kind of get your mind wrapped around what Canadian craft was?
So that is probably the best question because Canadian craft is very difficult to find and to advocate for because it is just not part of the daily life of people. You know, I think in Europe, for whatever reason, I grew up in France, and we incorporate craft-made things. We know about what we call the métier d'art, but you know, we all want to buy the plate that was made by the guy we know. We go to the furniture maker and all that. In Canada, it just is not part of the culture. It's not part of daily life. So it's taken a lot of searching and connecting to try to understand what it is. It's also an immense country. So you have, you know, makers and craft people spread around, and you know, even in my little area here, I'm on an island. It takes me 40 minutes to get to, you know, some of the makers, and 2 hour drive is nothing here. So it's geographically spread out. It is very underground. I think also that there's very few avenues. I want to say no, but there are very few avenues for craft to really come up to the surface and for people to be aware of it. So there's no big craft fair. Quebec is more active and has some craft fair, but in Ontario, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, you know, I think BC used to have the Vancouver Craft Week. I think it has moved to a biennial, but so there's no real market, no real avenue. There are very few galleries who do craft. There are very few publications. And the makers, I think, are, when you contact them, they don't quite believe that you really want to pay attention to them and share the message. So they're slow to respond. A lot of them don't even have a website, or, some are so remote that they don't even have internet. So it really has been a lot of searching and talking, and I don't feel that I have a good understanding of, or a full picture of what craft is in Canada, again, because of geographic diversity. And you go from Nova Scotia and the maritime provinces that are so active and so rich to, in the prairies, there are very few people, very few villages or towns where there are very few craft as a result.
One of the things you've done as someone who is an advocate for craft is to tell other people in other countries about Canadian craft through a variety of ways. One of the first things you did was to start a gallery. And can you talk about how that started and where that was?
The gallery was in Toronto, and it started in 2010. It remained open for 7 years. And I opened it because I couldn't find, it was a contemporary jewelry gallery to start with. And I started it because I just couldn't find the kind of jewelry I liked in Toronto when I moved here in 2006. And I also noticed that what I could find didn't have necessarily the skills or the creativity that it could be. So I thought, let's set up the gallery and let's show people what is possible. And I think also that I wanted to share with women in Toronto a little bit of what European women feel when they wear jewelry. And so it was more, it was both a cultural exchange, a discovery, and to fill a need that a sense was in the market. I did represent some Canadian jewelers and other artists, because then I went more into I did some art exhibition in the gallery with the jewelry in sculpture and painting and all that, and I loved that cultural exchange. But it was, again, very difficult to find Canadian jewelers, makers, artists who were prepared to show their work and wanted to do it.
Can you talk about the feeling that jewelry gives you? Because if you started a gallery to help other people have that feeling, you must have a specific feeling that jewelry and fashion gives you. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I think the first piece of jewelry we usually wear is something that has been handed down to us by our mothers, our grandmothers, more also nowadays by our fathers, and men wear more and more jewelry. So there's this sense of roots, of continuity of the story, of the family story. It's usually given to mark a special moment. So, sometimes it was your first communion, you got your first watch, which is a way, it is a kind of jewelry, or, jewelry often marks these moments in life. And when you wear it, you connect to these moments, you connect to the people who give it to you. So that's one kind of jewelry. The other kind is the jewelry that you wear for beautification, because it makes you feel good. It makes you stand out. It makes you walk a little taller. And it also engages people. And that is something that I think women in Canada, and I don't want to generalize because, as you said, Calgary is just as different from Toronto as Cape Town to London. But in Ontario, in Toronto, that wanting to engage in a dialogue about what you wear is not something that is done here very easily. It's not something women think about here. So I wanted to show women that it's actually really nice to wear a piece that elicits a compliment or starts a conversation. And then you have another kind of jewelry, which is the message. It's almost the political jewelry. It's the jewelry that says something. And I always say that brooches are the best way to put out a message. And the suffragettes knew that. And there's a whole study and field of study in jewelry of the suffragette movement. And then after that, all the political movements have always elicited jewelry. So jewelry can really bring so many emotions and has so many functions. And that's what I really liked. I grew up in a family where women always wore a lot of jewelry. And so to me, that was where I started. It was natural.
You made a connection for me that I have not made before, which is that political pins were akin to brooches, which I have not thought about. Because in the suffragette movements, there were always these small pins there's collections of these now, and I'd never thought of them as an extension of the brooch. But that totally makes sense because you're putting it on your chest. It is almost a way of like leading with that idea, like we're putting our face forward or our belief forward, which in the times of women's suffrage was a huge thing.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that it's men are finding that out. We see more and more men wearing brooches, but the corporate pin, particularly in North America, that men wear with their company logo, is a form of jewelry. It's a form of communication. It says, this is, I belong. And it's a form for people to recognize each other and identify each other, particularly when in the men clubs, if you wear your corporate pin, that's so it is a fantastic way to communicate.
So how did you transition out of the gallery space, or when did you decide to shut down the gallery space, but then continue the business in a different form? How did that transition take place?
In 2017, we had a change of lifestyle in our family, and it just felt like a natural time to change. Running a gallery is not for the faint of hearts. I mean, it's a form of retail, and retail is physically exhausting. So it just came at the right time. The whole thing evolved, and it was the right way to do it, the right time. But my clients were most unimpressed, which is a fantastic, it's a fantastic compliment. And they suggested to me, what are we going to do now? Why don't you take us on trips? So I carried on with my writing. I write a blog and a newsletter, and I've been doing it for 10 years, actually since 2010, almost every week. And it always had an angle. When I had the gallery, it was, to talk about the artists and designers I was selling, but because nobody knew them, it was very much an educational newsletter and blog and sharing. So I carried that on. And then I added the travel to it. The first trip we took was at the end of 2017, I think. And for me, it was just a different way to connect women to the makers and to the world of craft, and to carry on making these women, converting my clients from clients and consumers of craft object into patrons of the craft world, of the concept of craft, of the values and all that. And the travel seemed to be a fantastic way to do that, because you can't get more connected to the makers than when you are in their studio, or when when you touch the clay, or when you learn to do the embroidery and you see how complicated it is and how skillful it is. Then you connect with them, and you cannot but become a patron. So that was a fantastic suggestion of my clients, and also a fun way to do it.
Where did you guys go? Like, I know you've been on many trips, but can you talk about one or two?
Sure. So I specialize in four geographic area: the UK, France, and South Africa, because I have deep roots there and big networks. Adding at the moment Canada, because I'm just starting to feel that I have a network good enough to travel. The trips are usually, we just came back from a 12-day trip to Somerset and London. And the trips are maximum 10 women. And I always get that question, why do you only take women? I only take women because it's just easier to create an itinerary that appeals to everybody's interest. Unfortunately, as soon as you start mixing genders, there's just a difference in interest. And the trips are very much about learning, about discovering, about experiencing, but also about connecting among the guests. So we visit, so I organize, everything is taken care of. There's nothing for the guests to worry. And we visit studios, we do workshops. We don't do anything of what I call touristy. So if the guests want to go and visit Buckingham Palace, they're free to do that. I build time in them for them to do that, but I won't take them there unless we have a special curator who's going to take us to Buckingham Palace and talk to us about a specific craft, that was in that building. So, for example, we went to Salisbury Cathedral this year, and I gave the guests half an hour to go and visit the cathedral, but then we had a private tour of the library, and we had just done a book binding workshop. So we looked at the 12th century books, and we looked at the paper, and it was fascinating because the librarian curator had pulled out for us some books of the 14th century that showed how to organize a coronation. And we were in London we arrived in London on the day of the Queen's funeral, so that was very much au fait. So it's very much about discovering a culture and an area through its craft. And I believe very strongly in the what I call the sacred trilogy of craft, which is people, place, process. I didn't invent that. I'm not the one who came up with that. So that's how, through that, we discover an area, and we learn, and we connect with these people. And I think that through that connection, invariably, when we come home, we still have that connection to that place we have visited, and we care about that place. And I almost want to say, if, for example, the Canadian government decided to do something that doesn't jive with the UK, we would connect through our trip. We would have that wider connection to, foreign affairs and to economy and to all that, because we went there and we spoke to the people who live and work there and create there. It's through one visit you can explore an infinite range of topics and issues.
Can you connect the idea of patronage to education? Because it seems to me like you, as a person who appreciates craft, you can go to one of these artists and you can buy one object from them. But what you've seemed to have done is that you then go educate 10 people or more. Then those 10 people go and buy 10 objects from that artist. So can you connect that relationship between educating yourself and others and how that generates patronage?
For sure. I mean, the snowball effect is it's fundamental to supporting craft. And I always tell my guests, I said, when we visit these studios, you're very welcome. I encourage people to obviously support the maker and purchase. Our principle is that Rubigal, my company, we don't take commission on these sales at all, unlike a gallery or other curators. So I encourage women to purchase, but don't purchase something you don't like, and that's fine. But what I know is that when you're going to go home, even if you haven't purchased anything, you're going to be talking about your trip. You're going to be talking about this maker, and your friends will then go on the website and visit. And when they travel themselves, they go and visit. And I think it's hugely important to educate people about the reality of what it is to be a maker, and that patronage is about learning. It's about talking. Of course, it's about buying, but it's also about maybe taking a workshop with that maker, and then you come home and yourself, you might, we did a book binding workshop, and some of the guests bought the book binding kit because they're going to be doing it with their children when they come home. So it is absolutely part of the it's a fundamental element of supporting craft. It's sharing the knowledge and what it means to be a maker, and the impact it has on society.
I wanted to talk a little bit philosophically about the way the collector base for craft is aging, because this is something I think that you've probably seen as a gallery owner. I hear a lot of gallery owners talk about that as their main clients are starting to deaccession their collection, actually. So they're not collecting anymore. They're starting to sell that collection on the secondary market. The big question is, how do we get young people engaged with craft? And I wondered if you have any thoughts with that. Like, how do you get not your clients, but your clients' kids? How do you get them engaged?
It's a really important point. So some of my clients bring their daughters with them on the trips. And then that's a way of educating. I think that we get them engaged by showing them that craft can be part and should be part of their daily life. So craft, I think, has the art craft, which is becoming so expensive that, yes, it's completely out of reach for younger people. They just don't have the money. But I think that if we can teach younger people that instead of going to IKEA to buy a chair or to buy a garbage can at $7 in plastic that's going to outlive them by 16 generations, you can actually go to the potter in your village or next door and commission a garbage can in ceramic that will be beautiful, that will survive, and that they will take care of. And that is craft. I think that people have forgotten that craft can be functional, can be, accessible, but we have to change our way of thinking and our purchasing reflex away from the IKEA and Habitat and all these enormous businesses that appropriate craft and pretend they're selling made by hands things and therefore it's craft. It isn't. And teach our children and the younger generation and show them by our own actions that, you want to buy, you're setting up your new home, you need plates. You can buy plates, you can afford plates that are made by a small studio and by someone that you can visit and talk to, and who might even, make a bespoke thing for you, and you still can afford it. So I think it's by teaching the younger generation that craft lives in the home, that you can engage with it every day in every room of your home, that is just as affordable as IKEA, and that it will really enrich your life because you're connecting with someone, you're supporting a local business, you're not shipping stuff across the world, and all these values of craft.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns, and they have no plans of slowing down. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. And you said the words purchasing reflex, which I think has a lot to do with the younger generation. I think sometimes people just go to Target or go to IKEA or wherever out of a reflex. They're not consciously thinking, what is the most beautiful object that I can find in the price range I want? I think they're just thinking, what's the easiest object that fits my style already? And I think with engaging with craft makers, there is some labor, there is some needing to find the person, needing to know about them. But one of the roles that you do now is through you've been doing this for a long time, but through the newsletter is that you really promote artists. Your newsletter is not a promotion of you. It's a promotion of artists across the world that you're sending out over and over and over again. So how many of your readership and of the club members themselves do you think are younger folks? Like, do you have an age demographic?
Unfortunately, my demographic is older too. I'm starting to see an increase in the 30 to 40 year old, which by my standard is much younger than me. But I can see also that in my children's generation, who are in their late 20s, they are starting to think differently. They're much more aware of the environmental cost of the Targets and the IKEAs of this world. And they're also aware of the environmental cost of the Amazon delivery. So they are prepared to wait to look for something that is well made, or to buy, secondhand or vintage, or to change their purchasing reflex. But I think also that there's an issue, going back to your point about education, is that beauty is not taught at school. Beauty is not a concept that people value. And beauty is not just visual, it's holding an object that is well made. But because we don't teach anymore at school to make things, because we don't teach visual art the same way as we used to, which is what you have in your home, kids are not aware that buying the most beautiful thing you can is something that they can do. They just don't know. So that is another way that we can bring down the age of the audience for craft.
And I think those conversations about beauty are not efficient, and when I think about secondary education, like high school kids, those teachers want to get the students in, get them educated, do what they got to do, and then get them out. At least in the US, it's very much of a high volume system. There's a lot of students. They're usually teaching math, science, pushing, those types of things. And sometimes the humanities, I think, get edged out because it's just not as efficient. So I love the idea of the conversation of beauty being had over the dinner table with your family, or, with friends, or, or whatever. So, at some point in your sort of business development, I had listened to an interview where you talked about you started to have salons, which were conversations about beauty and about other topics, and they were experiences. You were inviting people to have an intellectual experience with you. So, can you talk about that stage?
We were doing this dinner in a way that we picked one topic and we invited 20 people, and the topic was all that we discussed during the dinner, and it was at the center of the table. And so there were no side conversations. There were no conversations about the latest renovation or your kid's school, whatever. So it was like creating a bubble. And it was extraordinary, these conversations, because people came up with very personal messages and experiences and questions, and always came out, I don't want to say transformed because that would be very arrogant of me, but with something to think about, and often incorporated it in their daily life thereafter. And we often had artists and makers being with us. We had a salon, which was wonderful. We had a poet reading her poetry, and at the same time, a painter who was illustrating that as she was reading. And then we would discuss this. And so I think that creating something like that at school level would be amazing, or at camp. I mean, North American kids all go to camp in the summer. It's a bit of a foreign concept in Europe, and they do that, and it would be a great time to have that kind of conversation. And in fact, we are working with the local craft council, art council here, to sponsor a craft camp for kids, disadvantaged kids this summer. And I firmly intend to have these conversations about beauty, because it is just so important. And I think that also another factor that people don't talk about beauty is because there is, at least in Canada, a takeover of the home decor by interior designers. It's coming from Europe. It was one of my biggest culture shock, is that people rely on an interior designer to tell them what their home should look like. So as a result, the homes are, a very low color palette, very simple furniture. There's nothing in there that is exuberant or that is shocking in a way or surprising or nothing. Because you surrender your living environment to someone else who tells you what quote unquote beauty is, you don't think for yourself anymore. And you don't put your personal imprint on it. So how are your kids going to know? I mean, there's so many ways that beauty has been taken out of our conversation and of our daily life. So we need to be aware of that and vigilant.
What I think about the interior design, people have to have a certain amount of money to be able to pay an interior designer, but they can have a lot less money to buy an interior design magazine. And I find that people often are looking at interior design magazines, like you're saying, even if they can't pay the designer, they're admiring a designer and trying to copy that within their home. So when I go to my local paint store, there's literally like, this designer says use these paints and this designer says use these paints. It's like a marketing technique. But that's completely gone across American culture also, because there are so many TV shows now where interior designers are renovating houses. And that is like, my dad loves these shows and he watches them all the time. So this is another thing you're pointing out that I have not thought about. So it's nice to see these connections between the media and people's understanding of beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we've completely surrendered our free will to decide what beauty is. That's my take.
Can you talk about how COVID and the lack of ability to travel pushed your business into the digital space?
Yes, well, it was survival mode, and it was you make it up as you go along. When the lockdown happened, we actually were in South Africa, and we came back as quickly as we could before the borders closed. And I suddenly realized that my business was gone. I had 4 trips sold out for 2020, and in 24 hours, everything disappeared. And my first reflex was that I needed to stay in front of my customers. Otherwise, I would just disappear. So I can't quite remember how I heard about Zoom, but I had the first Zoom interview with 3 makers in the UK, I think on March 23rd.
Wow. Yeah, early.
And it was, yes, it was so early. And what was incredible, I've kept that video because and the way I do the Zoom calls is everybody can see each other very much as a community moment. And I mean, people where I didn't know these people, they found the event through the internet, I guess. And all these women were popping on the screen, and we're seeing each other for the first time. And you can sense the excitement in their voice of connecting. Yes, we're not completely cut off and all that. So that was very exciting. And I also very quickly realized that for the makers and the artists, it was the only way for them to stay in touch with the clientele. So for a year, every Wednesday at 1 p.m., I did an interview on Zoom of a maker. And then from that, we organized workshops because, again, I realized that the women were very isolated, but still wanted to make. So we did embroidery workshop, we did lino printing workshop. I think the only thing we didn't do was pottery because it was too complicated to ship clay. And then I also organized digital travel, live digital travel. So for Collect Art Fair, which is a craft fair in London that goes over for 5 days, for 3 days, about 4 hours in the morning, I had organized 3-4 galleries every morning to welcome us in their space. And they could do that because it was just the owner going in the space, so it was safe. And then we organized to have the artists they represent to join us on Zoom. And we would go from, in the morning, we would go from Stockholm to Paris to New York. And that was amazing. And it was all live. We organized also to break a bit the pace. We organized cocktail making session. We organized shopping in Milan. And that created the community. It didn't really support the business, but at least it kept me in front of my clients, and more importantly, it kept the makers connected to an audience. And they were able afterwards to follow up with the clients and to make sales that way. The interesting thing was coming out of lockdown and back into the real world and trying to figure out, okay, now I have guests and members in 4 different countries. When everybody was online, it was easy to gather everybody around a screen and give something to everybody. Now that we're going back to in-person and online, we have 2 chapters of the club, one in London and one in Toronto. But I have members, in Vancouver and in Washington, D.C. and Seattle and Leeds in England. And so how do we make sure that everybody finds something? So we found a balance that when we do an in-person event, which is a studio tour, I do a digital live before. So anybody who cannot join us in person at least can visit the studio and carry on enjoying that. And the artist can carry on growing his or her audience outside the studio. So it was easier to go full digital than to come out of it and figure out what it is. And I don't think that I've got it quite right yet. And I think we're going to see changes. Some people are ready to travel, others are not. Some people are ready to get into a group situation, others are not. It's still a very mixed bag out there.
Yeah, I think we're in a hybrid time culturally right now where things are just so mixed between the digital space and the physical space. But I wanted to end talking about a gift guide that you do for people in general, but also for the club members. Can you talk about how the gift guide came about, and then how you actually find the people, the artists that are going to go in that?
So it started 3 years ago. Again, it was lockdown, and I was wondering how can we support the makers. And Christmas is, the holiday season is a big time in their practice. So I created the first digital gift guide by myself. I just picked, makers, and I had a friend who was a digital a graphic designer, and we put it together, and it was very much a gift from us to the makers, and we spread it to our audience and to our press list and all that. Again, people are accessing the makers website directly from the gift guide, and again, we don't take commission. And the first one was entirely free to the makers, and they loved it, and they made sales. So the second year, we said, okay, well, this is good for them. We changed the system a bit, asked for a small contribution from the artists and makers we selected. And I just contact people that I know and I love. And it's very much about putting together a collection that is surprising, but also that shows people that you can buy a gift that is not from, an online store or whatever. This year, it's fantastic. It's the third year we're doing it. Again, those who've accepted the invitation are in. They made a small contribution of 200 of whatever their currency is, so everybody pays the same. It doesn't cover the costs at all of creating the guide, because it's hundreds and hundreds of hours of work. But this year, we received some fantastic support for it, including yours. And, it's been endorsed by the Michelangelo Foundation, which is a hugely important foundation in Europe that supports crafts and organizes educational programs and fairs. And it's really an amazing organization. The American Craft Council is supporting us, which is really terrific. It's my first connection with them. Cockpit Studios, which is a wonderful organization in the UK, in London, that is it's almost an incubator for makers, and provides them with studios and business training and support. And also by Objet d'Emotion, which is a jewelry gallery in London, because jewelry is still very close to my heart. So we just launched it, and going back to your comment about the snowball effect, we're asking everybody who receives it to share it with 5, 10 people, even 2. And again, the idea is to give as much exposure to the makers as possible.
One of the things that I'm so impressed with you is the amount of time you will spend advocating something with very little personal gain to yourself. And I think that speaks to your character.
Thank you.
When I was first learning about you, it was confusing because I was like, what? She's advocating, but she's not making money. I mean, I know that you have things that make money, but this is not a money making exercise for you. So can you talk about that? Because it's rare that someone will literally spend this much time advocating for other people.
Well, so thanks very much. That really touches me. Look, to me, it's my form of activism, and I'm careful to say that it is not. It's not charity. What I'm doing is not volunteering. It's not charity. We very much run it as a business, but as a business with a social conscience, I would say, a social purpose. But for me, it's my form of activism. It is a way to make sure that my legacy contributes positively to the society that my children, grandchildren, your children, and the next generations are going to be living in. The values of crafts are the values that I believe a society should have. Skills, knowledge, local business, sustainability, all these values. We have to be active and we have to support them. It's just as important to do that as it is to go voting. And what we are experiencing right now is that there's a very passive approach to what a society is or is going to be. It's starting to change a little bit because we are in such a dire situation. But people don't really, they don't really care. I mean, you never see anybody in the street picking up garbage, even if it's in front of their doorstep, because people are not connected. They don't really care anymore. And to me, the connection that craft creates is really what is going to make it possible to re-engage people into becoming involved in their community, into caring about it, into becoming active and participate in its shape and what it's going to be. So to me, it's my way of being an active citizen in my community. The business, sustains itself and it's fine. It provides employment, which is great, and it it supports makers and studios, and it has that educational aspect that you mentioned. Are really working towards, again, educating the younger kids, and that's the project for this summer. Will be our first project, and I really hope that it's the members of the club will take it up and carry on in their own community or start even a very small project. That's how we're going to make it happen.
Can you leave the website or a way that people could contact you or find out more or even join the club?
Yes, so the website is rupigal.ca, and you can join the club straight from there. You can email me so directly. You can attend any of the events, and there's a mix of, again, digital and in-person events. So wherever you are, you can participate in that. And once you become a member of the club, then we have a private, what I call the digital clubhouse, because we don't have a brick and mortar. And it's a place where the members then find each other and communicate. And I'm hoping we're creating a conversation there that is going to go beyond just, again, the discovering new things and consuming new things, but creating synergies. And we're starting to see that happening. In fact, one of our members is the executive director of a social enterprise for immigrant women. And she's busy setting up a sewing studio for these women. And she's engaging the members of the club to get ideas and resources on building the business plan for that sewing studio. So it's starting to, the snowball effect is starting to pick up and have, real impact on people's lives.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's been so nice to connect via Zoom after talking many times on email.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate, and as I said before, I so respect your work and what you do. So thank you for taking the time to discovering more about what we do.
like to thank Isabelle for coming on the show and also for the work that she does to advocate for the craft community. I was fortunate to be asked to give a quote for this year's gift guide, so I wanted to read you that to end today's show. When you give ceramics, you're not only giving your loved one an art object, but also a deep appreciation for time. The time it took the maker to refine their voice in clay, and also the curious and joyful time the user spends as they get to know the object. For me, that quote is about believing in the process, believing that all the time that I and you and the folks that are in your craft community, all that time that they put into the work, that has value, that's worth something. And I see that as a collector when I look at a potter like Shoko Terayama, who puts hours of work into each of her sgraffito decorated pieces. That time that she puts in, that means something to me. That's a commitment to craftsmanship that I recognize and honor. So if you're working hard in the studio, getting ready for a holiday sale or a solo show, just keep going. You know, what you're doing has value, and I certainly appreciate that you're out there doing it. If you'd like to get a copy of the Buyer's Guide, you can go to their website. That's rupagal.ca. Also wanted to take a minute to thank Amico Brent for their sponsorship of this episode, as well as the Brickyard Network. If you or your organization would like to sponsor an episode of the show, you can get in touch through the website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.